today's lecture, I want to conclude this semester with a kind of circular narrative by returning to the family history. I began by talking about the shipyard and the U-boats that were being built with slave labor, but also, and that is really the same process, with the exploitation of the labor of German shipyard workers and others. Looming over that whole enterprise is, of course, the figurehead of fascism, widely recognized, Mr. Hitler, Chancellor, Reich Chancellor, and Führer of the whole thing. Now, while certainly my father's side of the family gives me the anti-fascist perspective, and as it were, the victim's perspective on fascism, my mother's side of the family affords me these 2 degrees of separation with Adolf Hitler. And you've played the game with Kevin Bacon. So if you know a person who knows Kevin Bacon, you're 2 degrees of separation. And I'm not talking about walked into a room with once, but, well, I'll get to that. So, one day in 2018, I opened the New York Times that was then still in print. And on page 3, I think it was the half page, if not more, this man looked at me. And he looked mighty familiar. And of course, I immediately recognized the name, Reinhard Hardegen, Captain Hardegen, died suddenly and unexpectedly at the age of 105. My mother and I did not expect it because we had assumed he had long been dead. We hadn't kept up with him. So how did this man end up on page 3 of the New York Times with an obituary? And here he is on his 100th birthday party in the Parliament building in Bremen. For over 20 years, he was a member of Parliament for the Christian Democratic Union, the Conservative Party. Longer than that, he was part of the Committee on Ports and Trade and so forth, which is a kind of hybrid institution that includes members of Parliament as well as experts out of society. So this man, Reinhard Hardegen, is my link for the 2 degrees of separation. He was my mother's employer for also over 20 years. In shipping, the paint that goes on the ship's hull is a pretty important factor in keeping these ships moving. You have, especially with the steel hulls, you have barnacles that will attach themselves. And when it comes to merchant shipping, it's a penny pinching business. Some historians of merchants get it all wrong, right about the 19th century leaders of these shipping companies who are admonishing their kitchen personnel not to generate food waste, to make sure that people use just one towel and so forth, and interpret that in a cultural framework as a sign of their Puritanism. But it isn't. It really is a matter of having to look at narrow margins, which can make the difference between success and failure. So when it comes to speed, when it comes to fuel consumption, just how smooth that hull is makes a huge difference. And each barnacle slows it down more. So if you can put a paint on there that will keep the ship moving smoothly, then you have a winning product. The Danish paint manufacturer Hempel had that expertise, and they were one of 2 or 3 leading companies that provided these products. And in the Bremen office, Mr. Hardegen was the leader of that branch, and my mother was his secretary. So in the 1970s, I ended up occasionally, like after school, hanging out at the office, sitting on the man's lap. Then when he went on trips, sometimes my mother would be the one to take care of the flowers in his apartment. He lived in a very, upscale, old captain's type of apartment with artifacts from around the world, one of which, as a toddler, I smashed to pieces, an ancient valuable vase. So that's kind of my connect to Reinhard Harding. I also apparently flattered him senseless, but at one point, also as a toddler, I told him that he was a handsome man. So what's his claim to fame? Here, for instance, is one of his casualties, the Robert E. Lee. And this vessel was sunk in 1942 in the Gulf of Mexico on one of his many missions as a U-boat commander, as part of the, what do they call it, the Wolfpack, attacking American and British shipping. But in 1941, as you recall, right after Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the United States. So in early 42, January of 1942, they had the first batch of U-boats that reached the East Coast to attack merchant shipping. It was just 5 vessels, one of which was U-123, commanded by Captain Harding. And his was a very successful expedition. In fact, if you have seen or heard about that movie, Das Boot, which when it first came out, I heard referred to on American television as Das Boot, is in part based on the memories of Mr. Harding, and he was an advisor to Wolfgang Petersen, who of course started his career as a maker of many beloved movies like Independence Day 2, and whatever, you know, those kinds of movies. So Jürgen Prochnow, who also died recently, basically plays Harding. And here is a...
After 3 weeks at sea, the glow of New York City proves an irresistible beacon.
Harding could see the whole skyline of New York, something probably every German dreamt of before the war.
The captain invites his crew up to the bridge to see the lights of Manhattan. But U-123 isn't here to sightsee. As they leave New York Harbor, the stern watchman spots a ship approaching from the rear.
Harding, he sees fully lit up against the lights of New York, a tanker, a nice large juicy tanker.
At close to 7,000 tons, British oil tanker Coimbra cruises unescorted out of New York Harbor. Captain Lieutenant Hardigan maneuvers his submarine into attack position with textbook precision.
It's part of the game of the U-boat commander to be cool, to be resolute, to be cold-blooded, at least to appear so, to create confidence within his crew.
Just 800 yards from the target,
Torpedo fire!
he launches his first torpedo. 58 seconds later, a hit. Flames lick 650 feet in the air and light up the night sky. Fueled by 65,000 barrels of oil cargo.
In fact, if anything symbolizes the total unpreparedness of the United States, it's this attack in New York Harbor.
Of course, it's all completely haphazard. Like, in order to navigate, they don't have the navigational charts. They almost run the boat aground in the harbor. They basically navigate by sight. And he has a guidebook. When he visited New York in 1932, as a young Navy cadet, he has a tourist guidebook with a simplified map of Manhattan. So that's their basic navigation. And it's completely opportunistic. they can't send more than 5 U-boats, you know. So what it does is it alerts the United States that they have to get ready for the war. They do, and then the party is over, you know, and then you get destroyers with depth charges, and that ends this thing. But this is, of course, a huge propaganda deal in Germany, and that puts them on the radar, as it were, or the sonar, perhaps. So here is some original footage that the war photographers took, and there's not much of it, and usually it comes like packaged with other stuff that's not interesting, but I'm just going to do this bit here. Some of it is from the trip, but most of it. So a couple of things about this. When it comes to the Navy, there's always this assumption that they were not fully part of the fascist state apparatus. For instance, you might have noticed that nobody did the German greeting here, no raised right arms. There's also part of the lore, especially of Hardegen, the gallantry. So that British tanker evidently blew up, and there probably were not that many survivors. But usually when they sank any boats, they made sure to either take survivors on board, or if they had to leave quickly, which often is the case, then they would commandeer other civilian ships, usually neutral ones, to go and pick up the survivors. In some cases, that also involved threatening to sink those ships if they refuse to do that. And these acts, which were considered common practice in the navies of the world, and probably still are, Hardegen got a lot of credit for at the end of the war. He was still personal friends. He became personal friends with some people who had been sailors on some of the ships he sank. Sometimes that backfired. You know, this idea that after the war all is forgotten. He was apparently trying to land a contract to sell a lot of paint to this Danish shipping company operating in Bremerhaven. And when they sat and talked, he said, "Oh, wait, I remember your company. I sank one of your vessels." And that ended the deal. My mother was there for that, and he was surprised that they took it so personally. You know, did you have a question?
Oh, I did. I just noticed that there was no Nazi salute. It was all like,
yeah, exactly. That's like the Navy. So, and according to the anti-fascist part of my family, my uncle, who was born in 1926 and had to join the military when he was 17 or 18, he considered himself lucky, and it was through connections he had that he got to enlist in the Navy as opposed to anywhere else. And saying, you know, there were decent people there and so forth. But, and this is kind of back again to that side of the family, but they set out to sea twice in brand new ships out of Wilhelmshaven, and they never got further than Helgoland before they were sank by British planes. And then was back to port. That was probably fairly cozy until early in 1945, when a division of 13,000 Navy personnel idled by the lack of ships was loaned to the army under Hardegen's command, and my uncle was part of it. They had 13,000 some of them just kids like him, very little in terms of weaponry. And of the 13,000 that they sent on these suicide missions, where the British were already advancing on both sides of the Weser River, 3,000 survived. And this is like in the last month or so of the war. They're just putting another 10,000 people into the meat grind. So Harding survived that. My uncle did. They were happy when it was over. But this is sort of the idea. You know, the Navy is not tainted by fascism. I'll let you read this bit from the obituary where I showed you the headline from 2018. Everybody read this? So the dinner, the reason for the dinner was, of course, to honor Harding specifically. It was like a dinner in his honor for being the guy who made it to New York Harbor. It was the occasion where Dönitz had given him the Knight's Cross. Hitler then got to give him the oak leaves to upgrade it. And apparently what Harding said was, well, Mr. Hitler, of course, we're going to lose the war because we didn't build proper naval air power. So it wasn't just like he criticized it, criticized strategy or whatever. And so this is the story that he told. And this is apparently also what happened. Jode took him aside and stuff. And so far, so good. This is a story of a professional officer who's not that concerned with politics, but also unafraid. Like, not just to speak the truth, but generally unafraid. And so after the war, when it was about simply upholding these traditions, he was a regular on those circuits. And I'm not talking like, you know, SS old boys getting together over beers to celebrate their racial ideology. That existed too, but people who were consciously policing everything to make sure it really wasn't about the Nazis. So you have, I don't know who this guy is, but you have American military history buffs lining up to talk to Harding, some land interviews, even before he became famous with the movie. And then, of course, this is the symbol of the club that keeps the traditions alive. And so he went to the crew reunions that they started holding, he and his wife. Other than that, well, he was active in politics. He ran the branch of the paint business. There's an odd rumor going around in the English language press. The New York Times had it too, saying he stopped running that paint business and became a oil, like crude oil merchant. And that's not something I've ever found confirmed anywhere. So I don't think that's actually true. What he did do when he got bored was he went on travels. So, for instance, in 1995, at the age of 82, he visited the North Pole. He had some gear still from that. So, at one point, when he ran into the leader of the parliamentary group of the conservatives, of the CDU, they chatted, and Harding said, well, my central heating has been out, and I've been waiting for the HVAC person to come around in the dead of winter, but that's not a problem because I have my Polar here. So I'm just bundling up. So he was insanely healthy and lived that time and that long time. And then in 2003, when he was 90, he decided to get on a Russian icebreaker that did a mission to the South Pole, just for the completeness of it. And I could not find any pictures to confirm this, but he says he raised the bacon striped flag of Bremen, similar in design to the US flag, but not pictured here, at the South Pole. There's the flags of the treaty nations that guarantee the neutrality of Antarctica at the South Pole. So maybe they took it down because Bremen is clearly not one of the nations and sadly has not been an independent entity under international law since 1867, much to its detriment. So all these stories, and when he was asked, he basically was like, because it was there, and also, why wouldn't you if you have the opportunity? So all of this makes for a good story of somebody who's just, a U-boat commander as a general military guy, adventurer, and badass, who's not afraid of things and is just, However, when it comes to the story between Hitler and Harding, that interaction at the dinner is not the last of it. In fact, when he spoke privately about his interaction with Hitler, there was a whole lot of admiration there. And he became quite emotional talking about that moment when he shook hands with the Führer and he looked at him with his steely, determined eyes and so forth. So clearly he knew at the time what kind of ideology he was signing up to defend by military means. And that is omitted from the later stories. Yes. Yes, I believe he does. Yeah. I don't know why that is. Maybe Hitler was a germophobe. That happens in those circles. Trump, too, I believe, is quite panicked about germs. And in fact, what happened is that after Harding called out Hitler for not doing enough for naval air power, Hitler then summoned Harding and said, I want you to run the torpedo, or no, I want you to tell me what you think is the most important thing to do to get the Navy up to speed. And Harding said, well, we need to get better torpedoes, so we need to put research into that. And then Hitler appointed him as the head of that research department. And they worked together and talked strategy a few more times after that. So as a matter of fact, no, it wasn't like he kept his distance. He was ready and willing, but invited to make the regime better at waging this war that had inherently racial and imperial content. And I don't know to what extent he was involved with the Type 21 U-boat that was going to be built in mass manufactured in Farge, but certainly he would have been involved at the torpedo end. So, in other words, with everybody who's got a story to tell after the war, you usually have to look very closely. And of course, this is a story people want to tell. They want to have like one branch of the military that is not tainted. And the Navy does lend itself to that more than others. But at the same time, it only goes so far. But here you have it, like the guy who's seen here shaking hands with Hitler is the same guy whose vase I brought when I was a child. And that's my 2 degrees of separation. Eerie, isn't it? Point is, this is not just for tantalizing. It is also to say that when I talk about fascism and when others in Germany talk about fascism, it is not some kind of caricature where you have this doofus running around with his right hand raised, and it happens in a foreign country someplace far away, to people and by people who you've never met and you have nothing in common with. And for us, and for me, this is direct family history. So when somebody comes around and says, there are 10 million, 11 million people in this country who I consider to be rapists and criminals and gangsters, sight unseen. If somebody comes and says, if I see a Black person brutalized by police, I'm going to assume that probably they had it coming somehow. When I look at people who say that, why do all individuals have one vote? This was during the 2012 election. If somebody as brilliant and good as Mr. Romney is in the running, who clearly would deserve a whole lot more votes than his counterpart Obama, for many different reasons, then I recognize that as a direct line of tradition to these people, not just to the hangers-on, not just to the ones who were marginally involved with it, but to the very heart of this regime and this evil. So to say you can compare it, to say, well, this is different. No, it isn't. It is very much part of the mainstream of the story of our Western society and, if you will, civilization. So the attempts of Americans to try and come to terms with what we're facing here, the repeated failures of these attempts to come to terms with what we're facing, and the insistence that they know exactly what they're dealing with, remind me of other Wolfgang Petersen movies, where somebody at some point will say, we are dealing with things beyond our comprehension, you know, when the alien monsters appear. Except, of course, here you have the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people are dealing with things beyond their comprehension and they have no idea that they are. They are under delusions of competence, expertise, and being in charge. So this is extremely dangerous. And if you think it can come to it, if you think this couldn't happen here, which, by the way, is the title of a book you've heard about, it can't happen here, right? Written in the 1930s, Sinclair Lewis, about fascism in the United States. Then, of course, you need to remember how things looked in Germany in 1932. People also thought, this is a civilized country. This is a highly developed country. And something as barbaric and uneducated as this Hitler guy and his movement will never amount to anything. So a few weeks of sustained propaganda and low to mid-level localized violence later, and people realize that, yes, indeed, this is possible. And they would still say, well, it may not be getting as bad. So this should serve as a warning. And of course, after the war, the people who pulled the triggers, the people who sent the torpedoes, reverted to being completely normal people, nice people, very handsome men with toddlers on their laps. So the idea that if you call somebody a fascist, you're dehumanizing them, you're othering them, you're somehow declaring them to be something other than a normal human being is already based on a wrong use of that term, which moralizes, which others it, as opposed to saying, you know, that is the point of it. It's the banality of evil. These are your neighbors. These are nice people. They're good to dogs. They treat their children well. They have fun stories to tell from all their exploits. There are other eerie connections that are just completely random. Like, I couldn't find a picture for her, so I didn't include it. But you remember Jud Süß, the propaganda movie, and the director Veit Harlan. His daughter, from his first marriage, was hired at the theater in Bremen in the 1950s. And at that point, she learned how to drive a car from my grandfather, who was a driving instructor. He was a literal Nazi driving instructor, who had been a member of the National Socialist Motorist Corps, which then seamlessly morphed into the German Association of Driving Instructors. I'm sure there's a couple of others that I forget, right? But I think I mentioned that my grandfather, who was the driving instructor, was stationed in the Netherlands in a cushy job because he was in charge of maintaining the vehicles and stuff. But of course, the NSKK, the motor corps, were also the ones in charge of signing up the Dutch for service in the SS division that was sent east. I mentioned this before. And there was plenty of collaboration. So my grandfather's best friend was a Dutch man who never visited the Netherlands and who lived in Germany. And you can think why that might have been the case. And I don't really know, if you brought it up, if you scratch the surface, where that would lead, you know, because there is denial, and then there is also just simply defiance. And people who will then say, you know, but the communists, we had to do it, but the Jews, the conspiracy. So they're still fully committed to the worldview that says we were not merely justified, we were forced, our hand was forced to defend Germany against this evil of Marxism, of liberalism, and the Jews that are behind it all. And if you know that mindset, and if you spend a day on social media, you will encounter it. and you ignore it and you dismiss it as the ravings of deranged, stupid, and evil people at your own peril. Of course, it pays well to be ignorant. That is how you get research grants and jobs. And that's how you publish books. Huh?
I just said I love Twitter. I just said I love Twitter. That's the joke, like you mentioned.
Is that your next book project? So, for that reason, I'm not optimistic. And I'm maintaining my German passport and that of my family current, so that we don't actually have to get it taken care of. But at the very least, and this is one thing that I learned from the people who look back and earnestly thought about what happened here to us, with us. What did we allow to happen? The idea was always, what would you have done? When will you speak up? How far does it have to go before you say something? How urgent is it to say something? And I've always come away with the lessons from the anti-fascist part of the family when it comes to that. It's better to say too much too early than too little too late. And if that means that I will be known as the guy who threatened Trump's life, which I didn't, by the way. I said that you will have to execute him if you want to defend your democracy, which is, as you will recognize it as something different. So be it, because that was the right thing. And the people who dismissed that and who made that into an argument for my dismissal from teaching duties, and who defend the decision to do that, and to cover for that, and to continue to do this to this day, are the ones who will have some explaining to in the future. I mean, they already do. They don't have to because they still have their cushy jobs, and they think none of this is ever going to affect them. You know. So, I remember when Andrew Anglin on the Daily Stormer put out the slogan, "Go, like Trump won. We're going to build the wall. Go, let these people know that they're not welcome." And the very next day, I went to Target, the South Fresno Target at that, where some guy in camouflage pants harassed a Hispanic woman. Just like, you know, I didn't hear exactly what he said, like under his breath, and she was like flustered but not shaken. You know, didn't try to say anything. The next day, I had people come to me in class saying, "Well, my parents are citizens, but they're naturalized. They're originally from Mexico. They want to travel there. Do you think it's safe for them?" So this happened at that time. And the way in which the liberal public managed to ignore that. If you look at the New York Times at the time saying, it's just a joke. He's going to pivot. We invited him to talk to us in our conference room here. And look, he's just a normal guy, you know. Nobody cooks, nobody eats things as hot as they are cooked, as they say. Well, not exactly. And there hasn't been a reckoning, but there has been an integration of the facts into the narrative. Like now you have a whole host of experts who write books about white supremacy. But there has not been any revision at all of the framework, of the political and mental and intellectual framework that led people to assume and to argue for the longest time that there is no danger of fascism and that there couldn't be anything like that in America. So, and I just want to, end it. I started with a picture of the big picture view of the North Atlantic, of half the world there and this sphere of operation. And I kind of wanted to bring it back to the local, to the place at the heart of Bremen, in the front of the town hall, city hall, where you have the sculpture, this modernist sculpture of the Bremen town musicians. I don't know if you know the fairy tale. It's a story of rural labor migration and rock music that is originally part of the Brothers Grimm canon of fairy tales about these animals who go and escape exploitative and abusive employment situations in the countryside and decide that they're going to become mariachis and head for the big city. They never make it there because they run into a rural inn that has been taken over by the cartel and take it over, and they make themselves at home there. So it's sort of a universal story that relates to other cultures and languages about talking animals. I mean, who hasn't run into talking animals in the woods?
I'm not sure they got out there.
I know, right? The original Fliegenpilz, the little guy with the red guts, yeah.
The first time, well, I mean, I saw it a few times when I was there. The first time I saw it, I was like, what the hell is this chicken standing on a cat standing on the back? But then we did like a city tour and they were like explaining it. But
Oh, you were there?
yeah, I had lived there for like, not there, but I lived near Munich for
Yeah.
about a year.
So did you brush it out?
Yeah.
That's very important.
There's a weird thing, not a weird thing, but a lot of German cities have like statues of bulls or like animals.
Uh-huh.
Like when we were traveling, I was like, instead of like America where there's a lot of people with statues, it's like over there there's just a lot of animals, like representation, like
Yes.
for story.
Yeah, it's important to have like the spirit of the city embodied in something. And of course, this is actually just a sideshow. I mean, the Roland, the big knight statue around the corner from here, who holds his sword facing the church, defying the church and its authority over the burghers of the city. That's like the real civic core. But as far as folk tales and stories and so forth go, that's a whole nother stuff. And Roland the Knight, of course, is the one that goes back to the chanson de Roland. Yeah,
Yeah, isn't he one of the paladins of Charlemagne? Roland?
exactly. And he blew his horn and ruptured his carotid artery in doing so, because he blew it so loud. But that alerted Charlemagne to turn his army around and beat the Saracens on the mountain passes in Basque country.
There's a song about him.
That is right. It's like the chanson de Roland. The song of Roland. It's like a big book. It's an epic poem. It's good stuff. It's all about like the bishop
Can you sing it?
is my favorite. Yeah. My grandmother used to sing it to me. How much time do you have? You have about 3 hours.
We got, it's 10:38.
So, it's very medieval in the way that the bishop is the one who's like committing the worst acts of slaughtery. So anyway, I think the point is not to smooth out the edges of the story. The point is not to say, well, this is enduring and eternal. This is the real Bremen. This is the good stuff. The point rather is to have the story with all the edges and to keep these things in suspension and to keep all of them alive and conscious. So, but not just for the heck of it, not just because it is important to tell all stories, and it is, but rather because something follows from it. Like you adjust the world accordingly. And it used to be the thing was, you want to avoid at all cost that something like this ever happens again. Yeah, I really have no good morale to the story, I have to say. Other than perhaps beat the fascists wherever you see them. That would be one. I have nothing to offer to round this off. So I'm going to end the lecture here on that note.